Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. We love to get our hands dirty with the really complex stuff, and today we're diving into the sometimes rocky relationship between the U.S. and Ukraine.
Yeah, it's a really interesting time for those two countries
Big time.
because on the surface, it seems like things are pretty straightforward. The US is supporting Ukraine in this huge conflict with Russia. But if you pull back the curtain even just a little, you start to see that things are a lot more complicated, a lot more nuanced.
Oh, absolutely. And we've got some sources that really get into the nuts and bolts of it. Some really compelling news articles and analysis pieces that show that beneath the surface, it's not just about, standing up to authoritarianism. It's about power dynamics, who controls resources, and how this whole conflict is reshaping Europe.
Right. And one of the things that really stood out to me is this proposed agreement between the two countries.
Oh, yeah, this thing's causing a lot of buzz.
It is, and for good reason, because it raises some really big questions about the future of the US-Ukraine alliance and what it's actually built on.
So one of the things our sources dive into is this revised American proposal that's on the table right now.
Right. It's all about Ukraine's natural resources. And, at first glance, it kind of looks like something they've seen before, something similar to what Kiev already rejected, actually.
Really?
Yeah, but when you dig a little deeper, some of the terms are even tougher this time around.
Like how so?
Well, the new proposal wants Ukraine to hand over a whopping half of the revenue they get from all their natural resources. Half. We're talking everything, minerals, gas, oil, even the money they make from their ports and all that essential infrastructure.
That's a huge chunk of their economy, especially now.
Oh, absolutely. And it's all supposed to go straight to the U.S., which is a pretty big signal that the whole dynamic of the alliance is shifting away from this idea of shared values and this fight against Russian authoritarianism. And it's moving more towards this very, transactional, mercantile approach.
It almost sounds like a business deal more than an alliance.
It does, doesn't it? And that raises a whole bunch of questions, like, is this really about securing those resources for the U.S., or is there something bigger at play here?
Yeah, what are the long-term implications of this?
Exactly. Are they trying to use their economic clout to influence what happens in Ukraine? And if so, what does that mean for Ukraine's future ability to recover, to rebuild after the war is over?
And will they even be able to defend themselves?
Right. There's this worry that the agreement could actually drain funds away from their military and their defense industry, which obviously wouldn't be good for them.
No, it wouldn't. And, we can't forget that Zelensky already pushed back on an earlier version of this whole thing.
Oh, yeah. He flat out refused to sign it, which caused a bit of a stir with President Trump.
Yeah, it definitely wasn't a smooth process.
No, not at all. Because Zelensky, he had a different vision. He wanted to use those resources as leverage to get more support from the U.S. in the war effort.
Makes sense.
And he also wanted something that was totally missing from the original proposal, security guarantees for Ukraine.
Which, are kind of important when you're in the middle of a war.
It's a pretty big deal.
So he's really in a tough spot. He's trying to secure the aid they desperately need, but he also has to protect Ukraine's sovereignty and their economic future.
Right. He's basically walking a tightrope, trying to make the best out of an incredibly difficult situation.
A high-stakes game of chess, for sure.
Yeah, with the future of Ukraine hanging in the balance.
Now, on top of all of that, you've got all this anxiety brewing in Europe about the direction the conflict is headed.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of uncertainty floating around.
For example, we saw the Italian Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, expressing some serious concerns about this idea of deploying European soldiers to Ukraine.
Right. She doesn't think it's going to be effective, especially without those ironclad security guarantees for Kyiv.
Yeah, and, that kind of echoes what U.S. Vice President Vance has been saying.
About Europe needing to step up and take more responsibility for their own security.
It's like this ongoing tug of war between wanting to be more independent and the reality that they still rely heavily on the U.S. when things get tough.
And Meloni, she's made it very clear that any serious action needs to be anchored in the Euro-Atlantic framework.
Which means?
Which means the U.S. needs to be directly involved if they want things to work.
So all of this is happening while President Trump's pushing for a negotiated peace.
Right. He's been advocating for Russia and Ukraine to come to some kind of agreement.
There was even that super quick meeting set up in Riyadh between U.S. and Russian delegations.
Yeah, it definitely seems like the U.S. is trying to shift gears and find a way to bring this conflict to an end.
Which brings us to another really interesting angle that we found in one of our sources.
Oh, yeah, this was a fascinating one.
It was an article arguing that Trump's approach to Ukraine, which has been pretty controversial with his criticism of Zelensky and his willingness to talk to Putin, might actually be the only way to end the fighting.
It's a pretty bold statement.
It is, but the article lays out this whole case about how the West has poured a ton of resources into supporting Ukraine, but they haven't really achieved what they set out to do.
Right. They're acknowledging that the situation's a lot more complicated than it might seem at first glance.
Yeah, and the author makes this point that even though Trump's style can be kind of abrasive and maybe not the most diplomatic, he's actually the one who's calling out the elephant in the room, the corruption in Ukraine.
Which a lot of people seem to be ignoring.
Exactly. And they also point out how everyone's so quick to praise Zelensky's wartime leadership, but they tend to overlook any flaws or mistakes he might be making.
It's like they're saying we need to be more honest about the situation, even if it's uncomfortable.
And the author argues that by bringing these things out into the open, Trump's trying to break through the gridlock and force everyone to find a solution.
Even if it means shaking things up and ruffling some feathers along the way.
Which he's never been afraid to do.
Never.
It's a pretty provocative perspective, right? Challenging the whole way we've been thinking about this conflict. It almost feels like they're trying to take control of Ukraine's entire economy.
Yeah, it's a pretty big ask, and it really makes you question whether this kind of agreement can really foster a strong partnership between the two countries.
I mean, can there be genuine trust when it seems like one side's benefiting so much at the expense of the other?
It's a valid concern, and then you have to think about how this would play out for the people of Ukraine. Would they see this as a fair deal?
Right. Would it create more resentment, more instability, especially when they're already trying to rebuild their country?
Exactly. Those are really important points to consider because it's not just about the money. It's about the political, social, and even ethical implications of this kind of agreement.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting that this isn't the first time this demand has popped up. There was a similar one in an earlier version of the proposal.
Oh, yeah. The one from February 14th.
Right. So it seems like the U.S. is really determined to get access to those Ukrainian resources.
It definitely shows that they're willing to use their influence to get what they want.
Which, they have every right to do. But there's a fine line between asserting your interests and potentially alienating your partners or creating more instability in the region.
It's a delicate balance for sure, and that's where diplomacy comes in. You need skilled negotiators who can understand the complexities of the situation and find some common ground.
And who can build relationships based on mutual respect.
Exactly, because at the end of the day, we're talking about real people's lives.
Which brings us back to that article we talked about earlier, the one with the alternative perspective on Zelensky and the situation in Ukraine.
Oh, yeah. The one that wasn't afraid to paint a less than flattering picture of him.
Right. It goes into some pretty sensitive territory, doesn't it?
It does. It talks about the allegations of corruption, his ties to powerful oligarchs, and even the suppression of the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine.
Stuff that we don't usually hear about in the mainstream media.
No, not really. But it's important to remember that even in wartime, it's crucial to keep a critical perspective.
Yeah, Zelensky, like any leader, has his strengths and weaknesses, and understanding both is essential for getting a clear picture of what's really happening.
Absolutely, because it's easy to get swept up in this narrative of the wartime hero, but we have to remember that this conflict involves real people with all their complexities and flaws.
And the article even suggests that the West might be unintentionally contributing to this kind of cult of personality around Zelensky.
Oh, definitely. There's been a lot of focus on his image, his wartime leadership, and he's been embraced by Western media and politicians. But that idealized image can sometimes obscure the reality of his leadership and the challenges that Ukraine's actually facing.
And let's be honest, the war in Ukraine isn't this simple black and white, good versus evil story. It's a lot more complicated than that.
It really is. And reducing these complex geopolitical situations to simplistic binaries like that never really helps anyone.
No, it doesn't. It makes it harder to understand the nuances, the motivations, and the potential paths to peace.
And it can even dehumanize the people involved, which makes finding solutions that actually address their needs that much more difficult.
So it's crucial to stay informed, to engage in thoughtful discussions, and to really challenge ourselves to think critically about these complex issues.
Absolutely. We can't just get swept up in the emotional aspects of the situation. We need to understand the historical context on the political dynamics and the economic interests that are at play if we want to find a real solution.
And part of that is recognizing that there are multiple perspectives on these issues and that understanding those perspectives is key to moving forward.
And we also have to be willing to challenge our own assumptions and biases. It's tempting to see our side as being completely right and the other side is completely wrong. But the truth is usually somewhere in between.
And, the article we were talking about is pretty critical of the West's role in all of this.
Oh, yeah. It argues that even though they've provided a ton of financial support, they haven't actually achieved their goals.
And they say that's because of a combination of naivete, wishful thinking, and a reluctance to address the corruption within Ukraine.
It's a pretty harsh assessment, but it does make you question whether Western policies are actually helping to resolve the conflict or just dragging it out.
It's a really important question to ask, and it's not enough to just declare our support for Ukraine. We have to be honest about the challenges, the risks, and the potential costs of our involvement.
And we need to think about what a successful outcome would look like, not just for governments and political leaders, but for the people who are actually living through this war.
That's a really important point. So, do we want regime change containment of Russia, a negotiated peace settlement?
Those are the big questions, and the answers are going to shape our actions moving forward.
And those actions have to be based on a realistic assessment of the situation, not just wishful thinking or ideology.
Exactly. It's a complex situation with no easy answers, but the stakes are incredibly high.
There's no doubt about that. The decisions made in the coming weeks and months are going to have a huge impact on Ukraine, Europe, and the whole world.
Absolutely, which is why it's so important to stay informed, engage in thoughtful discussions, and think critically about these issues.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all the complexity and just retreat into these simplistic narratives.
It is, but it's in these moments of uncertainty that informed and engaged citizens are most needed.
Couldn't agree more. It's so easy to get caught up in emotionally charged arguments and oversimplifications.
But if we want to contribute to a more peaceful and just world, we have to embrace complexity, be open to different perspectives, and be willing to question our own assumptions.
And that's what we try to do here on The Deep Dive. We want to help you navigate all the complexities of the world around us.
We're all in this together, learning and exploring as we go.
So we've covered a lot of ground today. We've looked at the proposed agreement on Ukraine's resources. We've talked about the different perspectives on Zelensky. We've discussed the human cost of this war. What stands out to you as we consider the implications for the U.S.-Ukraine relationship?
I think it's clear that this relationship is at a crossroads. Old assumptions are being challenged, and the power dynamics are definitely shifting.
It's a critical moment, a turning point that requires careful attention, nuanced understanding, and a willingness to engage with all the complexities involved.
And it's a reminder that the world is constantly changing.
Alliances evolve. Interests clash. The only constant is change.
But one thing remains certain: the choices that are made today are going to shape the world of tomorrow.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
It's been a pleasure as always.
We'll be back soon with another thought-provoking exploration of our complex world.
Until then, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
Subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.